In a previous episode about Beirut Blast trial, we mentioned the Neishabur train disaster that occurred in Iran back in 2004 and killed about 300 people, injuring about 400 others. We refer to the case because while searching Iranian media's coverage of Beirut Blast, we realized many outlets were making comparisons to that disaster. However, the Neishabur train disaster was different. Even though the train was carrying ammonium nitrate as fertilizer, it was loaded with cotton, sulfur, and fuel. There was initially a major fire, the derailment of a train, and eventually a massive explosion, which killed people and firefighters on the spot.
Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. With us today is Dr. Bruce Baird. We're going to talk about the explosion in Beirut that we talked about before, but from maybe a more in-depth perspective. So, welcome, Bruce. Could you give us a little background on your academic journey to get to this point?
Okay, I have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Texas A&M University. I worked in the industry for 5 years. Then I decided to change course, and I went on to get a PhD in history. And I taught as a professor for 3 years, well, actually 5 years, before I decided to change course again and end up moving to California and become a high school history teacher, which I did for the last 15 years until I retired in 2017.
All right.
So that's my basic background coming to the point where I joined Twitter in the fall of 2017. And before that, about 2013, I had taken the red pill on 9/11. I had seen that everything I had taught as a history teacher, professor for all these years on 9/11 was a lie. And I just started questioning everything. And
what year did you figure that out?
It was late. I was not.
Wow.
I resisted.
Wow, that must have been a really wild ride.
It was. I was. They talk people who were psyoped. I was psyoped. I know.
Well,
even though
we all were
professor,
for some level.
Oh,
of
it
time,
took me a long time, and I had to teach this stuff.
That's really impressive. I mean, that takes some real intellectual fortitude to break free of it after that.
It did.
After that long of
that's
indoctrination.
As being one of the ones who indoctrinated kids, I didn't realize it until I see it. And when I saw that, I started trying to introduce it into my classes, my high school history classes, and I got a lot of pushback from the administration and other teachers. But I kept.
What year was that you were getting pushback?
Well, from the very start. I mean, I was not shy about it. I was open. I would talk to my fellow faculty and members about it. I would bring it up. They'd say, "Can you come in and talk?" We were having a little session on how to teach controversial subjects, and they had the whole high school. And and I said, well, all right, you want to hear that? I'm going to say, how do you teach about 9/11? And, I had to do a regular presentation. I had to, I knew I couldn't just slam things down students' heads. I had to how do you get them into it? I'd start out with the Spanish-American War and the sinking of the Maine and how that had been questioned and increasingly questioned over time. And then suddenly changed, well, what about other things? What other things could be questioned if you question that? And so every year I do a little bit more until I was really starting to butt heads big time. I was putting posters up in my room that said, question everything. And eventually I had to retire. I couldn't keep doing that anymore. It was, but I decided in 2017 that I was going to turn to activism, researching, trying to figure out a way to get other people to question 9/11. Mostly it was 9/11 when I first started. It was all, that was the big event that I thought, I've been psyoped, how do we try to get to the truth of this? I was an engineer, so I joined Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I signed their petition, one of the 3,600, engineer architects who signed that. I did that for a while, but I kept asking too many questions. I just kept going. Every group I would join, everything I would try to do with it, I would question to the point that I was persona non grata. They didn't want me to keep there asking questions. I discovered nuclear. There was some people who were working on the nuclear explanations for 9/11. And I thought, oh, they really are. They got some good stuff, good material. So I started going down that too. And and asking again more and more questions until I kind of, all right, well, I'm asking too many questions for even them. I have so many things. And but that's what I was doing. And then what happened was on August 2020, I think for the past several months, I had been tweeting about COVID. This is Twitter. I had like 45,000 followers on Twitter. I've been building up my Twitter database and asking, and challenging anything with the official story, but especially when COVID started in March 2020, I immediately started questioning that like you did. You told me you started questioning it. It just made no sense, and everything about it seemed rotten. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, I see on my Twitter feed a picture of this blast and in Beirut, and I said, "Oh God, that's nuclear." I just said, I had part of the things I had done as my 9/11 research was that I had discovered the work of these physicists who were looking at nuclear explanations, but they led me to all kind of other people who had questioned like the truck bombings, all these truck bombings in the Middle East, going back to the early 80s, that they were telling me these people, these are names like Dmitry Kalasov, you probably haven't heard of him, Dmitry Kalasov. There was an Australian investigator named Joe Viles who were questioning all of these truck bombings because they left craters. And he said, truck bombs won't leave craters. Truck bombs won't leave craters. And I said, okay, well, I don't know enough. But they said that's why they couldn't explain it with a truck bomb. It had to be some kind of mini nuke, underground nuke that caused these explosions in, wherever, all across the world. There were these explosions, supposedly truck bombs. So I started questioning those, and I didn't want to accept what these people were telling me about truck bombs. So I started doing my own research. I started digging into any kind of like declassified information about explosions and craters, and I started digging deep into that information. So I knew all that on August 2020. I knew this kind of information, and then there was revelations of this huge crater. All of a sudden, they were telling me there's a 43-meter deep crater in Beirut where that warehouse 12 was. It's like a 13-story deep building right there where that building had been. And they're saying 2,750 metric tons of, ammonium nitrate laying in bags on the surface of this warehouse but no way, it's impossible. So I launched a thread where I started questioning it and saying that there's no way the official story is right. And in fact, the only way that could explain that huge crater was an underground nuclear device, a buried nuclear device to blast that huge of a crater. And I also happen to know that people, the first thing they would question about that was, well, where is the flash? Where is the EMP? Where is the radioactivity? And I had all that information that I'd been researching about third-generation nuclear devices that the United States, and other scientists around the world have been working on since the 1950s. And people would say, oh, it's impossible of a nuclear device because this is that. I said, well, they don't know the status of modern nuclear devices, which is much more sophisticated than people commonly know. So I started challenging the official story in those directions back in August 2020. Like from the very beginning, I was challenging it, and I've kept challenging it ever since, presenting more and more information. Every year I present more and more information to question that story.
Why would it need to be underground? Isn't a nuclear blast powerful enough that it would just disperse the material?
Chris, your picture isn't there anymore. The question is, how do I know it's underground?
Yeah.
Well, we have like over 300 years of writings on explosive cratering. How do you make craters? Back in the 1600s, back in the 1500s, they were trying to do these sieges of castles, and a big part of it was how to bring the walls of the castle down. And the way they would do it was they would dig tunnels under the walls, and they would plant gunpowder back in that day, and blast a huge crater, and that would bring the walls down. And they were calculating how deep you had to be, how much gunpowder you had to put in there. And they kept refining that knowledge through the 1700s, 1800s, beginning of high explosives like TNT, into World War I, those huge craters they blasted on the Western Front in World War One. A lot of research I've done, all the historical. I mean, I'm an historian. I first and foremost consider myself a historian, and I find the best materials going back in time to figure out what people knew when, way before modern times when information gets distorted quite a bit. So I went through World War One into the World War II, into the beginning of the nuclear age, and all these tests. A lot of the tests that I did on nuclear weapons was declassified beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, after there were revelations of people who were exposed to radiation, and there were lawsuits against the government. They used to put these soldiers right in harm's way, like right up next to these huge nuclear explosions. So they were suing the government, and the government protected itself by releasing all this information about those nuclear tests, and a lot of it had to do with the craters that they blasted. Plus, they were doing all kinds of experiments with high explosives like TNT. And I remember Chris on the previous video talked a lot about ANFO. They would use ANFO and TNT to simulate nuclear weapons, and they would do the same test. How do you know how big an explosion was? Well, a lot of times they would do it by the crater that it would make. They would blast them with explosives lying on the ground, above the ground, and under the ground. There had been a lot of testing under the ground because a lot of the government was interested in how to do construction with nuclear weapons. There was a whole thing called Project Plowshare back in the 50s and 60s, where they were trying to use nuclear weapons to build dams and roads and ports and all kind of other things using nuclear weapons, before they realized they had the problem with radioactivity. They couldn't get rid of it. But they did a lot of research on cratering. How do you crater? So there's tons and tons of information on this. And I knew about it. I know that if you have an above ground explosion, basically all it will do is compress the ground. The explosion goes, the path of least resistance goes up. And if it's above the ground, it just goes up in the air, it goes out, but it doesn't press the ground down. That's a path of most resistance. All it can do is compress the ground underneath it. So if you have an above ground explosion, you'll just make this sort of dip into the ground. If you want to blast a crater, most people think of the crater as blasting out. You have to put that explosion under the ground. That's 300, 400 years of research or knowledge about cratering. You put them under the ground and you blast a big crater. So this 43-meter, this is like the third biggest crater that had been blasted by explosives. Next to, there was a couple of them, one in the Soviet Union, one in Nevada. That back in the early 60s, they had blasted bigger craters, like 100-meter deep craters. This is a 43-meter deep crater. This is a huge crater. This is, people don't have a sense of because it's underwater. And but this is a monstrous crater, and there's no way to do it above ground explosion. Even the biggest nuclear explosion would, even those huge, the biggest blast ever could not have blasted that kind of crater unless it was underground. And I calculated with what I had found from this, from these declassified information, that it would have taken about a 5,000 ton, equivalent 5,000 ton nuclear bomb or nuclear device under the ground, about 50 meters, 150 feet under the ground, to blast that big a crater. It was deeply under the ground. This is not a missile striking the ground, and penetrating it. They could not have done that. This is a nuclear device planted. They do this. This is the way they test underground nukes. They drill holes in the ground. They slide the nuke down. They have it all electronically set up, wireless controls, etc. And it's placed at a certain depth. And this is like around 150 deep. Down in under the port of Beirut, there is like alluvial sands. It's built, all those the silos, the warehouses are built like, I think, I can't remember, 14 meters of sand, and then below that it's limestone. It's limestone bedrock there, and these bombs are down in the limestone bedrock. They drill the hole down into the bedrock.
So that would be interesting because, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just was going to ask, who do you think has been experimenting nukes there? Do you think it's, in
the world?
In Beirut? No, in Beirut, if you think that was a nuke explosion caused the whole thing, who do you think was doing it? Because obviously, the Lebanese government has maybe perpetrated it, but it's not the Lebanese government who's doing it, right? I don't think they have the capability.
To me, it's not the drilling and the placement that's the issue. Are these, I believe, are these very sophisticated nuclear devices. And this is I made this back in August 2020, my argument, and it's still the same today. I've added a lot more refinement, but these are very sophisticated. I call them third generation nuclear devices. And the key thing is that they produce, they can be made to produce a minimum amount of residual radiation. Because in both Beirut and also where I found these same kind of devices, and I'm not the only one, I said people like Joe Viles, Dmitry Talasov, and there's some other people who have made the same case that these same kind of nukes have been used back since the early 80s. Smaller nukes. This is the biggest of the ones that we know of, as far as I know. But they've never reported any kind of residual radiation. Where are the Geiger counters? People say, where are the measurements? They may be covering up evidence of radiation. They may be. It's very easy as you control the site of the explosion, you can eliminate a lot of evidence that might be used to show that these are nuclear devices, but the devices themselves are much more sophisticated than what anybody knows commonly.
If it's a very efficient fissile material, like use of fissile material, it could be very low levels of radiation because you don't really have that much debris to spread over such a large area. So I don't know. But I think more importantly than mini nuke conversation, which has been, I think it's just the fact that, like, for example, 9/11, like, the problem with analyzing that is because, like, it's hard to know what exactly happened. And so everyone just discounts the fact that because you can't say exactly every detail of what the alternative, what actually may have happened, rather than the highly detailed fairy tale that's been given to us. Like, somehow you can't be right, or you shouldn't be skeptical because you don't know every minor detail of what happened. And I think that's the problem because, and it's good to come up with speculative possibilities, but what's even more important with the Beirut blast and with 9/11 and with all these stories is that the actual story they give us doesn't make any sense. And that's, like, fundamentally, if you can prove that it doesn't make any sense, then you can provide the fertile ground for all this other speculation. But it doesn't have to be. But to say that it definitely was some speculative outcome without proof of it, it makes it easy for the people who are trying to promote the narrative to discount you as crazy conspiracy theory, because obviously you don't have any proof. Neither do they, obviously, but doesn't matter. They came out with the story first, so they can dominate the narrative. But I think in the Beirut case, it's just fundamentally the explanation is a joke. Like, right. And they came out with these stories, like, in Nature magazine and these scientific papers, like, to make it look like it's a scientific peer-reviewed paper, but they're just opinion pieces trying to show how the story could happen. Like, that within weeks of that, or a week of that event, they had these opinion pieces in the scientific journal. So the engineers and whatever who are like, wait, I don't think ammonium nitrate acts like that, they have these stories in there where it says, oh, if it's a large enough amount of ammonium nitrate and it heats up and it pulls into a big pool of molten ammonium nitrate, then all of a sudden it can explode just like that. So this has not been written about before. So this is all this fanciful, like, stuff that came out to try and prove this narrative, and it definitely wouldn't just explain a 43-meter deep hole in the ground at any level of ammonium nitrate. Anyway.
I mean, I agree with you totally.
I think you're right. It probably is something like that, some high explosive or just some missile. I mean, you could deliver something similar if there was a missile that had a uranium uranium tip on it, and it could burrow deep into the sediment before it let off its payload. You might be able to get something like that. But my main point is, how can scientists sit around and agree with this story that they gave? Because it just with just, like, old fertilizer or even ammonium nitrate that was meant for eventual use in some sort of blasting operation, it wasn't ammonium nitrate fuel oil mixture. It was just ammonium nitrate, according to their story. How that then becomes a high explosive after sitting 10 years in a high humidity environment, and then is exposed to some firecrackers, it doesn't make any sense. Like I don't understand. It sounds like a giant lie, and I don't know.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Well, I tell you, my experience, it actually began even before 9/11. When I was a little kid, I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I was in the time period. I was at the time after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and there was these I know you saw the movie JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK. There was this district attorney down there named J. Garrison, who was investigating the JFK assassination and coming up with all these conspiracy theories about the JFK. And I remember as a young kid reading the newspapers. I mean, I was immersed in this stuff, and I kept at it for a long time until you realize that the whole story is BS about Oliver, about Lee Harvey Oswald and the lone nut assassin, and this whole thing about a magic bullet. I don't know if you know the magic bullet that did all this damage to Kennedy, hitting his back and thing, and John Connally, who was a governor, on the front seat. And it's like, it makes no sense. But all that kind of evidence over the years led to people, a majority of Americans, not believing that official story, the Warren Report. They just didn't believe, but they didn't know what to do to replace it. They disagree. Was it the mob? Was it the Cubans? Was it the anti-Cubans? Was it the CIA? Was it the whoever? And so nothing ever came of that. It just disappeared. I mean, it's still there, but it's not going to go anywhere because they can all agree the official story is wrong, but they don't know what to replace it with. So they're just left into splinter into the wind, man, and they can't do anything with it. And with 9/11. Immediately, like I said, I took a long time to wake to that, but it was the thing I started with was the idea, yes, the official story is completely bogus. It makes no sense. There's no way that a plane hitting those buildings can cause those things to collapse at free fall speed. I mean, and so I joined AE 9/11, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth very readily to say, well, let's convince people that the official story is wrong. It's wrong. It can't possibly be. And I said, how do I awaken my own students to it? There was all kind of material that the architects and engineers had developed, a lot of videos out there that would get people to question the official story. And so I kept doing that. And I realized at some point, though, I had more questions. But how did they said controlled demolition, and how did that happen? How did they work out? It was nanothermite. They had things like, how did that? And I do my own research and question it until I said I became sort of persona non grata. I was asking too many questions about things that didn't make any sense to me. Yes, the official story didn't make any sense, but their explanations, the counter explanation didn't make any sense either. So what am I supposed to stop? Because they were happy with where they were sitting. They were saying, well, we have enough evidence to challenge it. Now we're waiting for some courts to come in there and say who the criminals are who did this. And I said, yeah, but you have a bogus story that's going to be tried. How are you going to convict anybody on a bogus story? You haven't asked the questions. They didn't want to ask any more questions. They were happy with, what about World Trade Center 7? What about Building 7? Well, what about that? Can we dig into that? And how did that happen?
None of it makes sense unless you're a billionaire owner of a friend of Bibi Netanyahu who owns a couple of buildings that are full of asbestos that are too expensive to renovate, and you want to claim double indemnity on an insurance policy. Then it makes sense to all that. It makes a lot of sense, that story, because then you can claim it was an act of terrorism and get your money. But
for me, that wasn't enough. I was asking other questions.
Well, no, I think speculation is an important tool in all research. It's just when it comes to these psyops where people are so big, there's a lot of attack on any criticism. Like, to create more space for criticism is difficult. It makes it more difficult. So I think it's good to talk about the possibilities of like very small. The mini nuke thing has been around for a while, and I think there's possibilities of it. Also, I think just high explosives and the use of high explosives in covert ways, even thermite in the buildings, that makes a lot of sense too. So I think those are all possibilities which we can say, okay, well, yeah, it's not the only option if you want to come up with a fantasy, and I can have ones that are more realistic and more in tune with with what we saw than planes hitting a building or fertilizer blowing up half of a city. So I think, I mean, even things like the Bali blast and the apartment blasts that
In Russia,
there's a lot of evidence those were high explosives. I mean, there were even photos of bags of HE that were being stored before, and people wondered what they were. So, like, those were kind of sloppy operations. So I think, like, that's possible that this is just another one of those where they did just fill a warehouse full of high explosive. It is interesting to know that I don't know what the sediment is like on how that would react to an explosion like that. In water, it would be a lot different than it would be like land in terms of a truck bomb or something creating a crater. But whether it would actually have to be underground or not, that's all very interesting, and it is good to talk about it. But I think, like, fundamentally, just the story just doesn't make any sense, and I think it would be really interesting to get someone on who is a diehard supporter of that story to try and understand how they can defend an oxidizer without any fuel creating an explosion. I don't understand how that works chemically, because all ammonium nitrate is a rapid oxidizing agent. When you physically jolt it, the oxygen atom is freed very quickly, and it can burn whatever's nearby. That's what ammonium nitrate does, as I understand it. So,
there was a Texas City explosion in 1947. This huge blast, which is actually very close to where I used to live.
But that was a plant, right?
Yeah.
That was a fertilizer.
That was a ship. Plant. That was in they've had many ammonium nitrate explosions over the years. Pure
ammonium nitrate without any without it. Just ammonium.
Well, that's nitrate. The question. People try to explain how did it happen. And
how many people's garden sheds have exploded full of fertilizer?
Right.
I want to know that.
No, yeah, it's totally
they're
safe.
Exposed to heat all day long in the summertime, and they don't explode.
And I don't think any body has actually changed the regulations for how ammonium nitrate is stored.
No, that's exactly
after all
what
these
I
things.
Said. Yeah,
I'm sure their warehouse is still full of them now, and nobody's even doing anything about it.
Same with 9/11. Totally how many building regulations were changed? None.
So we know if a building like World Trade Center 7 can collapse because of fire, wouldn't you think they want to change more
regulations? Who's pushing for that? Show me any politician pushing for higher regulations so more buildings don't collapse due to wastebasket.
So you realize that's part of the PSYOP too. That's part of the PSYOP. They're going to tell you this, and you buy it, and you say, but, and no, shut up. We're not going to.
Yeah, the shut up part is really important.
And I think, like, even if you take that, if you believe that the 9/11 story was a true story, which, as we said, we discussed, there are many loops and it doesn't make sense. The things that happen after it, the policies that come after that, the trial, the people who are apparently convicted, and the ones who have to pay for it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have anything to do with the actual
trial,
story.
You're talking about the Iranian government being held accountable. That was like two decades afterwards, and it was done by or maybe not 15 years afterwards or something. It was done just as a matter of, at that time, the government had seized all these assets from Iran, and some clever Israeli Zionist-affiliated lawyers were just figuring out how they could get their hands on that money, and so they came up with this bogus lawsuit to say Iran is guilty, and then they could just take the money, and Iran can't defend itself. So it's really more to do with
the official story. Yeah, exactly. But even the official story at the beginning did not mention that it had anything to do with Iran, but it was Iran that had to pay.
Didn't mention that they stole tons of gold from the from the building before they exploded it too.
And the same with and the same with the Beirut trial. The trial with Beirut, even if you believe that the official story is correct and it's true, the trial doesn't make sense, right? We talked about that.
Oh yeah,
the trial for the Beirut Blast. It doesn't.
There's a trial.
Yeah,
it's just another kangaroo court trial, just like the same thing with the Iran trial. They took these Syrian Russian businessmen, and they accused them that they were the ones responsible for like this fertilizer thing, not because they owned the fertilizer
in London,
or part of the fertilizer company, but because their company had the same secretary who signed for the other company that had the fertilizer. So the same like registrar, which is just like someone who rubber stamps the registration of corporations, probably rubber stamped thousands of corporations, because that company rubber stamped their corporation. They're somehow culpable for this other corporation.
Anybody who has money, and you can sue them. Yeah.
But that's because they were Russian and they had a lot of money that was frozen due to the sanctions in New York banks. And these same scumbags could like go and steal. I'm sure it's the same lawyers. It sounds like the same scam to me. But
did you hear the? I guess it was last week. Some New York court ruled that Iran was in fact culpable for the 1983 Marine barracks bombing. They knew they were trying to get Iran for a long time with that, but they said, yes, go ahead. You know, whatever Iran's opposition to that, they said we threw that out, and now we can go after Iran for that money for the 1983 barracks.
Truth doesn't matter anymore, and that should be really clear to people who are trying to like understand how could these things not be true? I mean, if you even question COVID or understand, like, there's no truth anymore. It's all just about cash and power. Like they've totally all the cover has come off. Like, so anyone who thinks that there's some sort of true people operating in these positions of power, if there are, they're just there as dupes. Because the whole system is now just run totally as a openly corrupt, and I don't know how long it can last, because eventually people are going to catch on to this en masse instead of just a few.
You would think. I don't know.
I mean, it's craziness.
I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it is really depressing, but it probably is going to end up in some kind of massive war. But I just think people are really stupid. So I don't know how long. I mean, the people who are managing the quote unquote managing the Ukraine war from the U.S. side are totally okay with open nuclear war. I mean, they promote the idea that nuclear war is safe, and so I think they don't care. They want to push Russia because Russia's a real affront to them. They've always hated Russia. The
Chinese, or one of them.
Or the Chinese. Yeah.
When I heard your podcast, though, I was, taken that really I haven't heard anybody in alternative media really question the official Beirut Blast story, except I heard you guys doing it. I mean, not going as far as I do.
I was waiting for it. I heard the first day
I
heard that thing. I was expecting someone has to question it. I mean, we questioned 9/11.
They don't.
I mean, why can't we question this thing? Is obviously fake. So I don't know.
I mean, when I heard. I don't know what to say, but I heard Marwa is her name Marwa? I forget.
Yeah, Osman.
When she was interviewing Osman, is that the minute you started bringing it up, she cut you off right away. Did you notice that? She did not want to hear about that aspect.
She edited out part of my bit about it. I get it, because like it's really embarrassing for the Lebanese government if they did have to buy into that narrative. Like, it's definitely not. And she's
but nobody does. No government questions it. No media questions it. So you feel like you are like stepping over a line to even question it at all? I mean, is that you're in a taboo territory at all? Do you get a sense of that?
I don't care. It's not even in my country. Like 9/11 at least is here in the U.S. So like I could get people would be really, really upset if I don't go along with like trying to, kill the scapegoat that they're all trying to kill. I get it, but Lebanon's not here. It just seems so fake. It's wild to me. And it's, I understood it because I did a lot of like research into ammonium nitrate, because when I first came around to like these mass terrorist events, they were all ammonium nitrate related. And it was like the blast in East Africa, the embassy blast. It was the
Oklahoma City,
and it was one other one. What was the other one? I don't know. There's a whole bunch of them. There was like 3 of them within a span of like 5 years. And and then the World Trade Center, the first World Trade Center
1993
bombing, and those were all. I mean, that one was an FBI setup. That's totally obvious. And the guy is still in prison, the patsy. It's really a bummer that nobody cares about him. And he was trying to be blamed on a Palestinian, just like they did with Sirhan or whatever. They always pick the Palestinian patsy so that it creates this notion of Palestinian terror in the American public, so that they can be rallied against the enemies of Israel, quote unquote enemies. I mean, the people who are just trying to protect their property from getting destroyed. So I saw all those things growing up, and then I realized, definitely the World Trade Center thing I knew was a scam from the beginning, because I read it. It was just like, and there were a lot of people criticizing it openly back then on the internet, because back then the internet was actually free. If you knew how to use the internet, it was all just a bunch of just nerds, and there was no oversight from the establishment. It was just a bunch of nerds on the internet, and it was great because everyone could talk about it. So everyone shared openly how to make bombs. So we all knew how to make ammonium nitrate fuel oil bombs with the anarchist handbook, anarchist cookbook.
Yeah.
And it was so great. I mean, it was written by a chemist, so it was like really detailed on why it works this way and how. It was a great educational resource, actually, even if you didn't want to become a terrorist. And so I studied all that, and I got it, and I understood it, because part of me, I just wanted to for safety's sake, because I use fertilizer in the grass, and was around a lot of my family with farmers, so people were using fertilizer all the time. I was a little nervous that this stuff was so terrible, and then when you realize how stable it is, and then you realize how much you have to do to it to actually make it explode, it's not easy to get that stuff to explode. You can't just light it on fire. You can't even light it on fire if it's soaked in fuel. It won't explode. It'll just burn. So, anyway, it was.
No, I remember that.
And shocking when I heard them say that at an old warehouse explode. And then if you look up where do these things explode normally, it's manufacturing facilities or people who are carrying precursors for the fertilizer production, because those are where it's really volatile and unstable. But once it's created, the ammonium nitrate, it's stable. So I don't know.
If you look at that, I did a Twitter thread back in the first anniversary of the Beirut Blast in 2021, and the beginning of it is all about ammonium nitrate and how people try to justify how ammonium nitrate can be explosive without fuel added, under what conditions. And there's
not just fuel; it has to be uniform. It can't just be like a puddle of fuel oil within a giant mass of ammonium nitrate.
A lot. You talk about contamination.
It's only the area where it's uniformly contaminated that would explode. Like
the problem is there have been a lot of these quote unquote ammonium nitrate explosions, and so they try to find ways to explain how this could possibly have happened, and none of them make sense. Or it's like cherry picking which information you want to do, but it doesn't. A lot of before this, the Beirut blast, a lot of scientists who study it would have said there's no way that could happen. I don't think you're going to find anybody talk about it now. They just won't.
Yeah.
Not going to
talk
about
the scientific papers that came out just after this blast, one's in Nature, like I said, I can't remember the other one, and they are actually, the material data safety sheet includes this stuff about, if you can heat a bunch of it up at once, it'll explode. This never, I can't find reference to it having before been part of the narrative, and I think they're trying to, like, part of the WEF, this new economic model that they're trying to push on us, which COVID was one of the main initial volleys to get this thing into the world, is the reduction of the use of fertilizer. So it's like the demonization of fertilizer. We saw that in the Netherlands. There was this whole anti-fertilizer thing. They were trying to get that as a pretext for further attacks on modern agriculture. And luckily, I think somehow that's politically been at least delayed with some new elections. I'm not sure. That election in the Netherlands is a little fishy.
I wouldn't put it past all those powers that shouldn't be.
The Farmers' Party is a bit like the Clean Air Act to me, like in the Netherlands. They say they're like this new party that's been elected that's supposed to fix that thing, but if you look at their actual, what they're supporting, it seems like they just were created by the WEF. So I don't know. But anyway, I think that whole agenda now is to like demonize ammonium nitrate. So I think we're going to see going forward, if there are more ammonium nitrate events, they're going to try and push for like ammonium nitrate that's very difficult to like, it's going to be difficult to get because it's a dangerous substance. So that's what I think. But
I tell you, one research I'm doing right now, I'm a few years ago, I did a study of the way 9/11 was presented. I went to the video camera. I think we're, talking about how the official story was laid out from the first minutes of it. But I went through all of the footage that was available from all these different networks and show how it must have been pre-scripted. There's no way they could have done the way it was presented to the American people, the world, without having a script that they're following as the way they presented it. But you're following these major networks to do that. With Beirut Blast, it was done on Twitter. It's amazing. The Twitter was ahead of all the alternative media people, certainly the mainstream media people, all lagged behind Twitter. Everything was being laid out. The videos were on Twitter. Everything was presented. And so I recently started trying to go back into Twitter, like a historian of Twitter, to figure out how they laid out this official story before, it became official. How did it work out there? And it's fascinating to look at it. Like, for example, one of the first things before they had any ideas about fireworks, which was one of the first ideas, that was a fireworks factory that exploded. They were always talking about comparisons to Tianjin, the explosion in China in 2015, which was an ammonium nitrate explosion, except it was at nighttime. And so the video footage of it is, you can't really see it because it's nighttime, it's a flash, but people are saying over and over again on Twitter that, the explosion reminds me of Tianjin. That's sort of like, how could you compare it? This is a daytime explosion, this huge thing in Beirut, and that's a nighttime, you can't see it. There were other explosions. There was explosions in Sana'a, in Yemen.
They were all
there was
fertilizer
at homes in Syria, that were daylight, that looked a lot more like that explosion in Beirut than Tianjin, but yet the Tianjin was an ammonium nitrate, and before anybody said anything about ammonium nitrate, they're already comparing it to, laid out a lot of these official, or the leading, Twitters are telling me, it's like Tianjin, it's like Tianjin. Well, how would you know that? Why would you even say that before, ammonium nitrate become the official explanation for it? They're already laying that story out. And Tianjin has a huge crater, right? Too.
So the whole point is like this: the material that they say was stored there was ammonium nitrate that was stored for about a decade in a humid port environment, and ammonium nitrate is hydrophilic. So after a number of years, it just becomes like a wet brick, and that water molecule that's attached to it, it doesn't, like, you can't burn water. So even if you oxidize,
it's not well maintained. Those photographs, they stacked the 1 ton, 2 1-ton bags stuffed, with supposedly this fertilizer, which is krilled. Now, krill's supposed to protect it from the moisture, and it's krill's kind of coating, they say. But but either way, it's not going to explode the way it did. I mean, there's just no way you're going to get. You mentioned without some kind of detonator. They need a detonator for sure, and just having fireworks or whatever that is, and that explosion, the big explosion happened 30 seconds after the previous explosion, and there wasn't much fire, like 30 minutes of fire, and then a 30-second delay after something, and now there's no way it's going to explode, let alone explode the way it did, which was one huge mega blast. A mega blast, that thing that we saw on those videos, could not possibly be explained by a bunch of fertilizer bags, however many there were, sitting on the floor for 6 years in this in this warehouse.
No, I mean, so the thing is, it could be a mini nuke, or it could be like, a team of 20 guys who went in there and rigged a warehouse to explode. I don't know if that would give us the crater we had, but either way, whatever it is they said is not true. And I think that's the important thing. And it's like, for this stupid case they had, this trial, which they're like trying to steal these Russian guys' money. I don't know why the Russian, I don't know. I mean, it seems like an easy defense. And obviously these Syrian Russian defendants didn't have access to defend themselves, because like I said in the discussion, all you need is a high school chemistry teacher to say that this isn't true. So I don't know. I mean, that part was what got me, was the fact that it's not true. And I think everything else is fair game, because they obviously aren't telling us the truth. So we should be able to come up with our own stories. But until they try and just like give us an explanation, the chemical reasoning for this happening, not just some qualitative verbiage in a Nature publication, but like some actual atomic explanation to how oxidization itself, oxidization of water could create a high explosive. I would love to know that. If there was any way of making explosions with just plain old ammonium nitrate, I guarantee you, like every redneck would have a YouTube video on that, because it's already fun to blow stuff up with these.
What about with fuel? Is it possible?
But you had to have
you have to mix it very precisely, like with the official story of Oklahoma City, which I don't buy either. It doesn't make any sense, but there's a lot of evidence presented at the trials. Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, that showed how do you make one of these things. And the cookbook, the rest of the anarchist cookbook talked to it's a very precise amount that you have to add. Otherwise, too much, too little, and it's just not going to explode. And that's even if you want to make something that is like a bomb.
But then you
made
can't
a lot
just
of
light it.
A lot of bombs.
You have to have a high explosive to create the high explosive. So you have to have dynamite or something really
powerful.
There's
a detonator of some sort, which they did, according to the official story. There was a detonator. And
but this train car didn't have it, is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, like a spark, like fireworks. No, it's not going to happen like that. But the thing I guess I should mention is that there are scores of these kind of incidents all over the world, and very suspicious incidents. And so the problem I think you get into is if I start talking about this and that, it's endless. The rabbit hole is very, very deep. Oh, and you want to talk about COVID? Oh, you want to talk about 9/11? You want to talk about that too? And then people say, well, what can I believe? I can't believe anything. Well, yeah, that's right. You can't believe anything. Well, how am I going to live that way? I don't know. I guess you start believing.
That's a good point.
Something. I don't know what you believe in. So, I mean, I do it because I enjoy doing it. Yeah, I see the crater. She sent it. And so that's a pretty good sized crater. That was not just a train explosion crater. I don't. Those are the kind of craters I've seen on other train explosions, but that was not caused by my thinking. Underground. It's an underground explosion that caused even that little sized crater, not some trains colliding with each other, combining somehow another to create an explosion. That was that blast, that big a blast, and that big a crater. There's something happened there. They had some kind of explosion already ready to go there. So. Yeah, I mean, but I haven't studied that one.
I don't know if you're looking at the Ukrainian war footage, because this war, or this it's a war on one side and a special military operation on the other. But the video coming out of it is there are some of these like HIMAR missile strikes and the Russian missile strikes. They're creating pretty big craters. So
no,
it doesn't have to be underground.
A penetrating missile can cause a crater. Oh, no kidding. Yeah. But it's a very precise kind of crater, and it's different from the kind of crater from underground explosion. And all I can do is look at it. They have a lot of the declassified information, like especially right after during World War II and after World War II, they were testing missiles to see the kind of craters they produced, and how big the explosion was. So there's a ton of information on missile-created craters. And then you can compare them to underground, above ground explosions. And really, if you give me a crater, you tell me how big a diameter is, how deep it is, the general shape of it. You can kind of tell what kind of explosion caused it. And the material, the media, the kind of dirt or earth or rock or whatever it's in makes a difference. And how much moisture is in it makes a difference. But you can pretty much tell what kind of explosion caused it. There's centuries of information about explosions making craters to back that up. But
I think it has to do with how much explosive power you have, and if that is, if you have a warehouse that you just pack full of high explosive, you could definitely do some big crater. So I think in the Beirut situation, it could be, and in the train situation, it could have been one of the cars just had a really huge explosive on it, but something. But I don't think the spilling of fuel oil and ammonium nitrate in a big puddle would create that kind of an explosion. Like, you would have to have a concentrated mass of the pre-mixed ammonium nitrate fuel oil in a mass that then you had inside of the mass, in the center of it, the detonation charge, which would be, dynamite or something. And then so that you would have the rapid explosion out there. If you had just like a bunch of stuff laying on the ground that was like a pool of fertilizer and oil mixed together flat on the ground in various viscosities. So it wasn't really, it wasn't mixed properly, and then you had some kind of fire ignite it, and I don't know, maybe it would explode like this. There would be a pressure wave of a thin layer of explosive, so it wouldn't create
it goes up. And
you wouldn't create this dirt rising up because it'd be a thin layer of high explosive rather than a compacted mass, which would then explode and rip everything out. So I don't know.
I think it's very important to also ask this question: who would benefit from that? And yeah,
I've done work on that.
What comes after that?
And this is inspired by Joe Viles, this Australian investigator who died in 2005. But he investigated the Hariri assassination back in 2005.
Oh, that was an interesting explosion.
Yeah, which I've done a lot of work with that too. But and the Bali blast in 2002. He did a lot of cutting edge work with that, where he laid out these ideas of these mini nukes, these underground mini nukes that could have caused those, or he believes caused those. And in fact, taken to Israel and these ideas of these clean mini nukes, these clean ones. So I was following his footsteps, but he laid out the idea that Israel has this policy of nuclear extortion, terrorism/extortion, that they extort these countries or terrorize these countries using these devices with total plausible deniability that there was a nuke, that they were involved in it at all. It's always, nuclear terrorism, but you can't say that it's nuclear terrorism. You can't say nukes are involved.
Yeah, that's right. Because you got to give you don't want to.
No, Israel wouldn't have done that.
Ability to pull its tail between its leg and obey you, rather than
everybody's in line. It's not nukes. It's not Israel. It's not nukes. Not Israel. But yet he says they extorted out of, you could say, both the Australian, because a lot of the people killed there in Bali were Australians, and he said there was a way to force Australia in line with the war on terror. It was they knew, the people in power know, they know who is doing this. They know what's happening. They make that decision based on that okay, you want more of this? Follow in line. And it's the same way I've shown this also with the 1983 explosion in the Marine barracks. That was in October 1983. That I'd made a case in a long Twitter thread that to me, Israel, Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, had means, motive, and opportunity to do that. And the same kind of thing that Joe Viles said in Bali. Those were these mini nukes, like a 10-ton. We're talking about the smallest of kind of nukes, clean under the
think they had
barracks.
That technology back then, though?
Oh yeah. But they did this. In my Twitter, if you read the one I put out in August 2020, that these were already developed in the 70s, that they had been working on it. And Israel.
Is that what they were? Yeah.
They're what?
I read about those. They call them the suitcase nukes.
Well, the suitcase nukes go back to the 40s, actually. The fear that these terrorists would bring in these suitcase nukes. But that was they were miniaturizing nuclear devices back in the 40s. When they're making them bigger and bigger, and they made the hydrogen bomb, but they were also making them smaller and smaller. And that's a history that's not really known very well. But in 1960s, early 60s, they developed these, 10-ton, 20-ton, TNT equivalent nukes that they fired with bazookas. There was a big test. Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and went to go see one of these tests in Nevada, where they showed videos of them firing this bazooka. Boom. There it is, this, 10-ton, 20-ton equivalent nuke. It weighed 50 pounds, a very light thing. They put them in backpacks. Wow. They could land. They were all designed for atomic demolition. These backpack nukes, they go in by water or land or air to land and blow up buildings, create huge craters, blasts. That was the days when they were still dirty, though. The idea of you put them underground, they would have not so much contamination that our soldiers could move into the area quite quickly. They defended the whole Eastern Europe. There was a line in Germany where they had these what do you call shafts that were dug ready for these nukes to go in place in case the Soviets ever invaded, the Warsaw Pact invaded. So they had all these things back in the 70s during the Cold War. The United States supposedly got rid of all of them, but there are other countries. I'm sure the Soviet Union had them. I'm sure China had them. France had them. But number one, Israel had them. I know Israel had the neutron bomb, which was if you can make a neutron bomb, and there's a lot of evidence that Israel developed a neutron bomb. Even who's the guy who did the Nord Stream, the reporter.
You mean Seymour Hersh?
Seymour Hersh. He wrote a book on the Samson option. Israel developing the neutron bomb. If they can develop a neutron bomb, which is the third generation, these are like basically they're fission fusion bombs. They're very sophisticated. They can be tailored to do whatever you want to do, including make them very clean. And if Israel developed the neutron bomb, which Seymour Horst says, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest they developed these clean nukes. And everybody else had their inspections. Supposedly they got rid of them. The United States got rid of all of these. Israel hasn't let any inspectors into Dimona ever, to see what they have. So who did it? Well, this is only one country that is doing this kind of stuff that I have evidence that, and Joe Viles had evidence, and well, who's still doing this stuff?
It's the one country you can't question too.
You can't question. You can't even talk about their nukes, and nobody in alternative media is going to question it either. So
that's definitely an interesting theory. I mean, anything's possible when the official narrative is so full of holes in these cases. So like but to have something that's as good of an explanation as that is
I'm still waiting for people to challenge it. There's experts.
Nobody wants to challenge the original story that's fake. So I don't know if you'll ever get that.
Yeah, they won't even go there. Maybe because I got in too early with this other story. They don't even want to go to the truth because it reveals all kind of stuff about it. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's nice. I think it's good to have the speculative options. I think, you were talking about the 80s and Israel like starting to do this sort of Samson option terrorism. I think that's clearly true. And, they had open conferences about like terrorism and
1979. Netanyahu, who's still there.
Netanyahu, exactly. His conference is like basically a way of doing projection propaganda to say that look at these Muslim terrorists coming up, and at the same time they knew they were the ones doing the terrorism, and then creating the scapegoat so that they could eventually. They probably had something like 9/11 planned out at that point anyway. So it's so there's all that is very well documented. It's just nobody pays attention to it. So terrorism has been sort of a key component of the whole birth of Israel from the Nakba onward. So it's it's plausible. I don't know if we'll ever know any of these things, the answer to them, but if you see what Israel's doing currently in the West Bank in graphic detail, you can imagine that they would not have any qualms about doing this on a larger scale. So
I've heard that part of the people back in the Beirut Blast, because I've looked at all these tweets, thousands of these tweets, I come across these certain themes that are repeated over and over again. One of them is that Israel would not, bomb this warehouse, and because they don't kill people, like they wouldn't do something like that.
That's hilarious.
It's like, okay, you believe they would do all these other things.
I think you were dealing with trolls from Tel Aviv.
So I don't know, but I don't know. I generally don't tend to focus on who, but I did focus on who in several threads, or a couple of threads at least, in 1983, and more recently I did one on the apartment bombings in Moscow in 1999, which is Russia's 9/11, and I made a case that Israel is behind those. Same kind of case. They
needed to get, it's just like the Bali bomb. Those occurred very close in time to each other, and they made sense because they were trying to get this whole war on terror started, and they need Russia's
war on terror.
It was the same, like they were both blamed on Muslim terrorism,
Chechens,
and it was obvious
Chechens.
That it was Putin. It was trying to get Putin into this game, and he sort of tacitly, I guess, tied onto it, but he didn't really join full force.
Well, he sucked up to the Israelis, to Benjamin Netanyahu, actually, in particular, who wasn't prime minister at the time.
Interesting how those characters keep repeating, because you gotta keep your pool of psychopaths small, or your game will get infiltrated by people who have souls. It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
So the moral of the story is to be skeptical about any official story, right?
Question everything.
So. I mean, that's
pick and choose which ones you want. If you want to survive and not go crazy, you pick and choose which ones you want to question. But I don't trust anything.
I think that's a very good policy, especially anything coming out of an official source. It's just
experts. Anybody who claims to be an expert or fact checker.
Yeah,
give me a break.
you have to look at them as a power.
Yeah, I see that
dynamic.
with Iran. I see that with Iran. Like the Iran experts are just outrageous liars, and anything that you hear about Iran expert. I mean, there are so many memes about them. Iran experts are usually the ones who are so detached from the Iranian society, who haven't seen Iran at least the past 40 years or something. They don't know anything about what's happening inside Iran, and they just have to sell their own version of, the story so that they can be paid by CIA and other foreign governments and everything. So that's my experience with Iran experts.
The Islamophobia that Israel gave birth to in that 1979 conference is what we're still dealing with. It's like this idea that Islam is the enemy, Islam is the terrorist, and they did that so that the West would try and unite against. I guess they figured they couldn't do Palestinians in general because they're Christian Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians. A lot of people don't realize that there are lots of Jewish Palestinians. Anyway, they couldn't unite against, because there would be, but they could if they did it with Muslims. They knew Muslims was a there weren't a lot of Muslims in America, so they could easily try and create this boogeyman, and they knew that like the European colonialism had degraded Islam, so they could create this boogeyman. And now it's continues with Iran with women's hats and the mullahs. It's like the same thing. It's endless how the Western woke elite can be so racist, and they don't really know it. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so should we wrap it up?
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Twice Told Tales. And we'll look forward to another interesting conversation next week. Hopefully we can have Bruce on in the future for some
anytime
new conversation.
Yeah,
Hopefully it's not about a terrorist event, but thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video.
I'll do it right now.
Yeah.